Interesting. You mentioned effects of cannabis on appetite, and I know one of the medical uses of cannabis is in people that are undergoing treatment for cancer in order to stimulate appetite, because oftentimes they have very low or even no appetite due to the cancer treatment. Is the mechanism by which cannabis can stimulate appetite known? And if so, what is the general trend of effect? It makes people hungrier, obviously, but we hear, again, in kind of recreational terms, of people getting the munchies, becoming exceedingly hungry. Is that related to some cannabis-induced effect on, say, blood sugar, like insulin or glucose regulation, or is it happening at a different level?
I think we almost need to take a step back, actually, to talk about how cannabis works in the brain before we kind of go into that. So
Great.
THC as a molecule exerts almost all its effects. They're acting at this one receptor, for the most part, that's widely expressed through the brain, called the cannabinoid type 1 receptor.
CB1.
Yeah, CB1 is the shorthand for it. And I think, as people tend to create analogies to describe what receptors are, for those of you who don't know, most people use like a lock and key analogy, that like a receptor would be a protein that sits on a cell, and a molecule that binds to it, like THC, is the key that fits in that lock. When it activates it, it triggers some biological process in the cell, in this case a neuron, that changes its activity in some capacity. And so THC acts on these CB1 receptors, which are very widely expressed. In fact, outside of like kind of ion channels that are expressed in the brain, the CB1 is, I think, one of the most, if not the most widely expressed receptor in the brain. It's everywhere. So it's really important. And I think as kind of you had alluded to previously, it doesn't exist in this didn't evolve in humans in the hopes that one day humans would find cannabis. This is just...
Although cannabis users everywhere use that argument.
I know people love to leverage things. If it's a plant, it's natural and safe. And there's obviously issues we'll talk about with that. But I mean, really, this is just biological redundancy. I mean, nature only has so many ways to create something. And so there's going to be things that end up overlapping in the way that they function. And so the receptor that's in the brain and throughout the body, the CB1, and there is also a CB2 receptor, it's not really expressed in the brain. It's in some of the immune cells in the brain, and maybe some limited distribution in actual brain cell neurons.
Where in the body is it
It's
expressed?
mostly immune cells. So you'll see CB2s mostly on like macrophages or other kind of immune cells.
Cells that gobble up debris.
Yeah, and that basically, regulate inflammatory processes. And so the main role of CB2 seems to be much more about like regulating inflammation. So that's kind of a separate role. That can certainly impact the brain in different ways. But when we talk about the effects on the central nervous system and the brain and behavior, we're talking almost entirely about CB1. And so both the CB1 and CB2 receptors, like I said, don't exist because nature was like, humans are going to find cannabis. This will all work together now. So there are molecules our body produces, which we call endocannabinoids. And they are kind of funny little molecules because they don't really behave, like certainly in the brain, they don't behave like a normal neurotransmitter. So, I mean, I assume most people who listen to your podcast are relatively adept with the basic idea of how neurons work. So you have neuron A, let's call it the presynaptic neuron, because you have that gap between the two cells where they communicate called the synapse. So neuron A releases a transmitter, and it can be something that excites the neighboring cell, neuron B, or it can inhibit it. And so the way that we always kind of talk about neurotransmission in the brain is neuron A releases a chemical that crosses the synapse, acts on neuron B, and it can either, jack that neuron's activity up or it can scale it down. And that affects, brain-wide patterns of activity. And we call that anterograde because it moves from neuron A to neuron B, which is kind of the general flow of things and how we usually think about it. So endocannabinoids are kind of this, little bit of an oddity in the sense that they could do the reverse. And so endocannabinoids are actually made in neuron B on the postsynaptic side, and then they go backwards and act on neuron A to regulate how much transmitter is released. And so in many ways, this is like, I kind of liken it to a thermostat model for the most part. Certainly if we're talking about something like excitability. So if neuron A is dumping out something that excites neuron B, like glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, as neuron B gets too excited, it's going to start releasing endocannabinoids to go back and tell neuron A to stop driving it.
So sort of a homeostatic scale and trying to maintain a middle range.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, no matter how you discuss it and what system you discuss it, I think the majority of people in the cannabinoid field would agree that the primary physiological role of endocannabinoids is to maintain homeostasis. That's what they do. They keep everything in its happy place, let's say. So like,
And that's probably why the CB1 receptor is so widely distributed, is that neurons can excite or inhibit each other, that is, raise or reduce the amount of electrical activity in the, let's say, nearby neuron, because here we're talking about retrograde signaling. But ultimately, you don't want runaway excitation, because that looks like epilepsy.
Exactly.
And you don't want runaway inhibition, because that looks like suppression of ability to think, move, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you want to keep things in where they should be. And so you want neurons to get excited, but you don't want them to get overexcited. And so endocannabinoids, in kind of a very prototypical sense, act as this circuit breaker, essentially, where they go back and gate how much is coming in. And they do this through various mechanisms, essentially turning off the electrical activity of that presynaptic neuron so that it stops releasing neurotransmitter. They can also regulate, though, inhibitory neurotransmitter release as well. And this is usually done through a little bit more of a complex process where it's driven by excitation, but then it regulates the inhibitory pathway.
So inhibiting the inhibitor leads to more excitation.
Exactly. I usually liken it to basically taking the brakes off of a car while you're going downhill, kind of thing. Like you'd use your braking system to keep things in check, but if you want to go faster, you take the foot off the brakes and you let things accelerate. And so this can be really important for things like forms of synaptic plasticity or neuroplasticity, let's say, where you want synaptic strengthening to happen. So like under a learning event or something, you want that synapse to really hardwire better. And so having endocannabinoids kind of turn off the inhibitory component is one of the mechanisms to facilitate that. But at the same time, if you want to have a bit more adaptive flexibility, endocannabinoids can weaken that synapse at the same time by acting right at the excitatory terminal itself. And so their ability to kind of play with the relative activity of a circuit is really dependent on which neuron they're acting on. And so they can regulate excitation or inhibition differentially. And I mean, CB1 receptors are found on virtually every single kind of neuron in the brain. Except one. I think you'll find this interesting because it's dopamine. And dopamine neurons are basically the only neurons in the brain that don't really, at least as far as we've been able to characterize to date, express cannabinoid receptors.
Interesting. If I may, earlier you mentioned one of the potential psychoactive effects of cannabis is euphoria. Does that mean that the euphoria associated with cannabis use is independent of dopamine and is more reliant on something like perhaps the opioid receptor system or the serotonergic receptor system?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that cannabinoids don't affect dopamine because what we understand in the ventral tegmental area, which is kind of the hot spot of dopamine neurons, or at least the ones that are involved in motivation and stuff, those neurons are regulated by a lot of inhibitory neurons that dump out inhibitory transmitter and keep those neurons kind of quiet.
So there's an opportunity for indirect regulation.
Exactly. So what you have is those neurons that regulate the dopamine neurons are very rich in cannabinoid receptors. This is actually kind of similar to how mu-opioid receptors work for things like morphine or heroin. And essentially what the cannabinoid receptors will do is when they're activated, they'll turn off that inhibitory control, and that allows dopamine neurons to kind of move into a state where they're more prone to go into burst firing and have big dumps of dopamine. Whether or not that relates to the positive affect or the euphoria, I don't think anyone has cleanly demonstrated that. I mean, obviously, dopamine's very complicated in terms of its relation to endpoints and whether it's reward or motivation. But cannabinoids definitely do have an influence on dopamine transmission. They just don't tend to do it directly. And I think that's this very bizarre and interesting component of cannabinoid signaling is why the brain would have evolved in a way to allow every other neurotransmitter system to be actively and directly regulated by endocannabinoids, but dopamine is kind of spared from this. So I don't know. No one, I mean, obviously you can always just theoretically guess as to why someone would do that. I don't know what the reason for it would be, but it is something that has kind of intrigued a lot of people because every other system in the brain is so tightly controlled to some degree by endocannabinoids, and then this one circuit is kind of free of it. So, but yeah, so the main role of endocannabinoids is really to regulate plasticity or homeostasis, allow flexibility of circuits to either goose up their activity or ramp it down if they need to, depending on the environment, depending on the experience of the organism. So there's a lot of kind of roles that endocannabinoids play in that domain.